guys, can we talk about the moral inadequacy of natural solutions to universal evil, suffering, and death? Thanks. So here's the thing. I'm thinking that any proposed solution to the universal crisis that was just described, especially involving death and evil, must satisfy these three criteria: logical coherence, practical efficacy, and moral sufficiency, right? So of these, moral sufficiency is arguably the most exacting. So let's talk about it. See, it demands not only that a solution work, but that it be good. Yet scientific or naturalistic systems, however valuable in their empirical domains, ultimately fail to meet this moral criterion. This failure is not due to a lack of sincerity or technical sophistication, but to the philosophical limitations of naturalism itself. Limitations that prevent it from accounting for, much less enforcing, universally binding moral truths. So first, let's talk about the limits of scientific epistemology and in moral context. So as previously stated, modern science excels at discovering mechanisms. It maps neural networks, for example, sequences genomes, and measures suffering. But it cannot declare what ought to be. Its method is inherently descriptive, not prescriptive. The natural sciences cannot produce universally moral conclusions because they're limited to empirical observation and predictive modeling. They cannot tell whether an action is right or wrong, only whether it is correlated with certain outcomes, which is good, but it doesn't help us here. Naturalism, the philosophical framework behind most scientific approaches, maintains that all phenomena, including consciousness, morality, and decision-making, ultimately reduce to material interactions governed by physical laws. Under such a framework, the mind is merely the brain. Morality is evolved behavior, and moral responsibility is either a psychological illusion or merely a sophisticated component of a survival mechanism. Yeah. This entails that all human action, including evil itself, is explainable in material terms, chemical, genetic, social, but not blameworthy. The implication is pretty severe. A worldview committed to naturalism cannot morally condemn evil as actually evil. It may describe pain and its causes, but it cannot provide moral imperatives to eradicate it at its root. So, this brings us to the problem of moral objectivity in naturalistic ethics. So, a morally sufficient solution must be rooted in truths that transcend cultural consensus and individual preference. It affirms that some actions, such as cruelty, betrayal, and injustice, are not merely maladaptive, but wrong. This is the domain of moral realism, the view that there exist objective moral facts. These are not invented by humans. They are discovered, like mathematics, for example. Just as no amount of social consensus can make 2 plus 2 equal something, no cultural consensus can make something good or evil. Yet within naturalism, such objectivity collapses. For example, some claim that evolutionary ethics can explain why humans cooperate or feel guilt, but even if it could, it cannot obligate them to do so. Adaptation is not goodness. To say naturalism produced empathy, or natural selection produced empathy, that does not mean that empathy is morally binding. Naturalism cannot bridge the is-ought gap. It can show what is, but not what ought to be. This leaves its moral claims as constructs, useful fictions at best, oppressive illusions at worst. Moreover, if humans are purely physical, biological machines, then all concepts of responsibility, guilt, and justice lose their grounding. Under strict materialism, and depending on your interpretation of wave function collapse according to quantum mechanics, choices are not chosen, but instead are, at the most basic level of reality, determined by the motion of particles, exclusively by the interaction of particles. The moral weight of decisions evaporates, which brings us to the function of truth in morality and the necessity of trust. So morality, more than any other evaluative standard, demands unwavering allegiance to truth. A solution to evil cannot rely upon falsehood, obfuscation, or manipulation, not even if the outcome appears beneficial. For example, misleading someone to accept a remedy, even one that reduces temporary suffering, undermines moral trust and thereby the entire system. This is why truly moral solutions must uphold truth, even to their own detriment. For instance, a scientist may withhold a terminal diagnosis to prevent despair, but this violates the patient's autonomy. A social movement, for another example, may suppress inconvenient facts to achieve justice, but this undermines justice itself. Another example, a technological fix may obscure side effects to ensure adoption, but this erodes long-term trust. These violations, however pragmatic, are morally corrosive. A righteous solution tells the truth, even if it hurts, even if it slows progress, and even if it costs lives in the short term due to a lack of progress. This paradox, truth over immediate benefit, creates trust, which is indispensable and ultimately more practical than a purely utilitarian, morally careless approach to attaining immortality and immutable good health. If people do not trust the giver of a solution, they will not want to follow it. No matter how practical a solution is, if no one trusts it on the basis of the moral failure of the system or its proponents, then its practicality, ironically, becomes useless. Thus, a morally adequate solution must not only work, it must be true in both form and motive entirely. Moreover, if its nature is such that it requires promotion for a widespread effect to occur, then not only must it be true, but so must its advocates. Naturalistic solutions, being rooted in probabilistic models and utilitarian trade-offs, lack a binding imperative to uphold moral truth, especially when such truth proves inconvenient to desired outcomes. While not all naturalists will necessarily compromise ethical integrity for the sake of workable solutions, systems governed by naturalistic frameworks are more susceptible to such compromise, precisely because they lack any transcendent obligation to truth-telling. This does not mean moral realists will always tell the truth more often. It means that they are, according to their worldview, more obligated to tell the truth, and therefore are more likely to do so when the stakes are high, when lifelong or eternal consequences could be at stake, whether out of a sense of objective morality or fear of negative consequences, if they break the law, in other words. In the absence of a moral or any moral absolutes, truth becomes instrumental rather than invaluable. Valuable only insofar as it achieves pragmatic ends. Without a transcendent moral anchor, they become malleable, shifting with circumstances and betraying the very moral trust they require. Fourthly, the moral universality and the need for a transcendent anchor is what we shall discuss. If evil is a universal problem, then the solution must be universally moral. But to be universal, morality must be grounded in something beyond cultural consensus, as we have discussed. It must be anchored in a standard that does not change, that judges all equally, and that defines good, not by utility, but by the truth. Such a standard cannot arise from nature. Nature selects for survival, not for justice. The lion eats the lamb without remorse. To derive morality from nature is to validate animalistic domination. To resist evil based on such a foundation is to deny one's foundation. Therefore, moral objectivity cannot emerge from below. It must come from somewhere else. Which brings us to the inescapability of moral demands. If morality is universal, then it must be derived from a universally influential source, a supreme, omniscient moral authority whose judgments are not only final, but, by definition, inherently moral, innately good. In this view, moral truth is not out there as an abstract principle. It is grounded in the nature and will of the one who is universally influential over morally conscious beings. It is objective in its application and subjective in its origin. Subject, in other words, to the supreme moral mind, but binding upon all, because it is sovereign over all. Now, an opponent to this idea may say, well, then the objectivity of morality is only determined by the moral agent who carries the bigger stick. How can this be anything but the subjective whims of another living being, just like a powerful human ruler, influencing the beliefs of their subjects? Well, this is a valid question. And if multiple moral authorities exist, that is, multiple sources of morality, then a universally influential moral source is reduced to being merely one moral agent among many, with nothing objective to offer. However, if morality comes from only one source, and that source is influencing all beings capable of responding to such influence, in other words, moral awareness, rather than possessing their own morality, then there is no competition at all. This uniqueness of the moral source is essential to moral realism. It implies that humans, animals, and all other sentient beings in all of reality do not create morality themselves, but merely respond to it. So finally, morality can be objective if it flows from a mind that is, first of all, omniscient. Secondly, granting moral understanding to all who can comprehend it with their available faculties. Moral understanding, if you will, defined as the knowledge of what the Supreme Being of moral authority wants and does not want, based on their nature. And thirdly, it must be necessarily good. Otherwise, good would have no objective meaning. So the universality of the revelation of the will of the supreme moral authority is the determining factor for human beings' perception of the objectivity of morality. Otherwise, all good we could possibly understand would be, by definition, the will of every being, which is not a comprehensible definition of anything we perceive as transcending natural socio-emotional constructs. It is not culturally relative. It is universally binding. It is not merely useful. It demands that one act rightly, that is, in accordance with the will of the sovereign moral source, even when doing so is harmful to self-interest or collective gain. Such acts, though painful, can reinforce moral trust. Logically and practically speaking, a solution that demands truth, even when costly, is more trustworthy and therefore more likely to be utilized than the one that justifies deception in the name of progress. So in conclusion, scientific and naturalistic systems fail to provide a morally sufficient solution to the universal problems of evil, suffering, and death. They lack a standard by which to judge moral worth beyond utilitarian means. They cannot ground the obligation to tell the truth, to seek justice, or to treat persons as intrinsically valuable when no positive physical outcome is foreseen. A morally sufficient solution must be grounded in objective truth, committed to justice, and capable of removing the reality and possibility of human evil and its consequences, without using evil as the means of its own destruction. It must be trustworthy, not merely effective. These are not optional ideas. They are necessary requirements for any solution that claims to be good. And they cannot be met without appealing to the mind and will of a supreme moral being, whose moral judgments are not constructed but revealed, and whose authority is not borrowed but absolute. Thus, the moral inadequacy of scientific and atheistic solutions lies not in their failure to imagine or pursue a better world, but in their inability to justify why that world should be called good in the first place. Scientific and atheistic solutions, while effective in mitigating surface-level suffering and prolonging life just a little, cannot claim to solve evil at its root. They cannot define good, restore the guilty, or create a trustworthy moral order. Any framework that denies transcendent moral truth is, by definition, morally insufficient. It may be logical, it may be useful, but it cannot be trusted to be good. A greater solution must be sought. So let me know what you think. Bye.